everyone, this is Mrs. Thorson coming to you live from Bunker 167. Today we're talking about the presidency and all that it entails, so let's get started. The presidency itself is very much an oxymoron because people want strong, powerful leaders and they want good ones like we saw with Washington and Jefferson and Lincoln and Kennedy. But they do at the same time want somebody where there's not a lot of power. They don't want someone who's going to be tyrannical or a dictator, because we are individualistic. That's what our country was founded on. We are our own people, and we are skeptical of authority. So the presidency really is a balance of whether or not to have too much power or not enough power. What are the requirements to become a president of the United States? Well, the formal ones, the ones actually written in the Constitution, is that you must be 35 years old, live in the United States for a total of 14 years, and be a natural born citizen. Now, you don't necessarily have to be born in the United States. You can actually be born somewhere else. Like, for instance, John McCain, who ran for president in 2008, was born in Panama. But his parents were both natural born citizens, so it counts. What are some of the informal requirements, meaning basically what are some things that are common in most presidents? Well, all except two, were white, male, and Protestant. The exceptions being John F. Kennedy being a Catholic and Barack Obama being part African American. They are all matters of professions, but mostly they come from political backgrounds like senators or state governors. Every now and then we've had a House Representative member. A lot of times we've had vice presidents become presidents as well. If you look at this slide, you're going to see many presidents that are what they recently did and their background and what political party they came from. The starting point is Eisenhower, and it goes all the way up through President Obama. If you look, it's a pretty even mix of Republicans and Democrats, never a third party. There are two different ways that a president can become a president, but the most normal route is through elections. And once they get elected, they get to serve a 4-year term. George Washington set the precedent of 2 4-year terms. He felt that if you served for more than 2 terms, you would almost become tyrannical and be more like a monarch. Well, most presidents after that followed that same rule until we got to Satan, also known as FDR, who decided that I'm going to do whatever I want and I'm going to run for 4 terms, and he served over 12 years. Now, I know you know the math of 4 times 4 is 16, but you need to understand that in his 4th term, he died in office of a heart attack. Because of what he did, the Congress and the states decided that we really need to limit the president to just 2 terms. So they created the 22nd Amendment in 1951, saying that only a president can serve 2 4-year terms or a total of 10 years, meaning that if they take over as vice president and serve out less than half of their previous president's presidency, they can run 2 more times. The second way to become president is through succession, in case a president dies, is removed from office, or resigns. The vice president succeeds the president if leaving due to that. And if the president is ever disabled, they came up with this idea with the 25th Amendment, and the president cannot decide whether or not the vice president should take over as commanding officer. They decide that the vice president and the president's cabinet must decide together if the vice president should take over as president in case the president is disabled. Sometimes the 25th Amendment has been used, for instance, when George W. Bush was getting a colonoscopy. He needed to have Vice President Dick Cheney take over while he was under the influence of all the drugs that he needed for the procedure. But that was just for a little bit. Dick Cheney is not technically considered a president in any shape or form. One of the ways that a president can get removed from office is through impeachment and actually an eventual removal by the Senate. An impeachment is just an accusation of a crime. The crimes that can be brought against them are any of treason, bribery, or any other high crimes and misdemeanors that the House of Representatives find is wrong with the president. If impeached, the president is tried in the Senate, and the Supreme Court Chief Justice is the man who presides over it. And we have had 2 presidents be impeached, the first one being Andrew Johnson, the second one being Bill Clinton. Neither one of them was ever removed from office by the Senate. And we had a 3rd president who was most likely going to be impeached, and that was Richard Nixon, but he resigned before any of that could happen. Here's a list of presidents who did not complete their term of office. Some of them actually completed one term but then didn't complete their other full term, like with Abraham Lincoln. Out of these 9 presidents who did not complete their term of office, 4 were assassinated, 4 died in office, and 1 resigned. The 4 that were assassinated were Abraham Lincoln, James Garfield, William McKinley, and John F. Kennedy. The other 4 died, and then, like I said, Richard Nixon resigned. If you look at this chart below, you are going to see the constitutional powers that the president holds. This is something that you can find in your book. I know it's kind of hard to see right now, but I do want you to look over this. He has national security, legislative, administrative, and judicial powers. So make sure you get a look at this because these are important things to know. In Article 2 of the Constitution, we do see that the presidential powers are pretty vague. So we have also seen the expansion of their powers throughout the years. In the 1950s and 60s, we saw the want and need for a very strong president, and people got that with Eisenhower and even LBJ. But in the 70s, people saw what they did with that power, like with LBJ in Vietnam or Nixon and Watergate, and people started to distrust these presidents. So people started to lose faith in them and not want them to be as powerful. The president's #1 job is to be the chief executive of the United States, where his job is to take care that the laws must be faithfully executed, or basically that means that he must enforce the laws. And the way he does that today is by expanding the powers of the government through the federal bureaucracy, who is the group that actually enforces the laws, like we see with the State Department or the Treasury, or for instance, like the Department of Education enforcing the No Child Left Behind Act. And he's in charge of all this. And they spend about $2.5 trillion a year, give or take, and the number of employees is at about 4 million people, both civilian and military. When it comes to presidential appointments underneath him, he appoints 500 high-level positions and about 2,500 lesser jobs. So he's responsible for about 3,000 hirings when he comes into office. That is why the president-elect gets so much time in between the election day, which this year is November 6th, and inauguration day, which is always January 20th, to get things done, because this is a time of period that he starts to hire people and get things in place for when he starts his job. The other top positions in the executive branch are the vice president and the cabinet members, the vice president being the only position named besides the president in the Constitution. Everything else is pretty much made up after that. What does the vice president do? They're the one that just waits in line hoping that the president dies. I'm just kidding. They don't hope that the president dies. They might secretly do in the back of their brains so they can become president, but that's just their job. They don't do anything. They just sit there. Now, at first, that's how it used to be, where they would just kind of sit there. Every now and then they'd get to be president of the Senate and break ties, but really they had no real position but to be waiting in line. But as of recent, we've seen this with Reagan, especially a little bit of Clinton, a lot with President Bush, that we're seeing that the vice president has been getting more power, Dick Cheney being the most influential vice president in U.S. history. That's George W. Bush's vice president. The cabinet is, they're just presidential advisors. They're not in the Constitution. They are experts on certain policy, and there are 14 different cabinet secretaries and the attorney general. So in total, there are 15 different cabinet departments, state being the first department that was created, and Homeland Security being the most recent department. Here are the list of the 15 cabinet departments, ranging from state down to Homeland Security. If you want to look at this more in depth, which I believe that you should, go look at this in your book. You just need to know basically what the functions are. You'll never be asked what year they were created. The executive office of the presidency is the rest of the people that work for him. It's made up of policymaking and advisory bodies that include the NSC, the CEA, and the OMB, the 3 most important. And this chart gives you an idea of the other bodies that work for the president. The 3 main executive offices are the NSC, the CEA, and the OMB. The NSC is the National Security Council. It was created in 1947, and it's basically the president's foreign and military advisors. It includes the president, vice president, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, and some other joint chiefs of staff. Also, of course, the National Security Advisor. The Council of Economic Advisors is a 3-group panel that basically gives the president the report of the economy each year. And the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, they perform budgetary functions and managerial functions, including making the actual budget and making different proposals for it. Other parts of the executive branch include the White House staff, which are the chief aides and staff of the president that actually work in the West Wing, which is part of the White House. They basically give him information and support and plan his days as well. The other person that's in the White House is the First Lady. They don't have an official government position, but many have taken on different projects that they have a lot of passion for and try to get put into play. Like, for instance, with Hillary Clinton, she pushed for health care. With George W. Bush's wife, Laura Bush, she pushed for literacy. And with Michelle Obama, she's been pushing for health and younger kids. When it comes to the president's legislative powers, he basically has two choices of what he can do if he wants to have power over Congress. The first one is just a plain veto, where the president rejects a bill and can send it back to Congress. And the only way that that can be overridden is with a legislative veto, which would require 2/3 of a vote to override it in each house. There's also the pocket veto. The pocket veto is basically a way that a president lets a bill die if he gets it within 10 days of Congress adjourning. Because if the president doesn't want to sign it one way or another, and he knows that Congress is going to adjourn within 10 days, he can just let it die and sit on his desk, or as they say, put it in his pocket and let it die. Now, there is something called the line item veto, which allows a president to veto certain parts of a bill. That actually is not allowed. Presidents have asked for this, but they don't allow it. Some states do, like, for instance, Illinois allows for a line item veto. This table gives you an idea of the amount of vetoes that each president has had since Eisenhower. You can see that he did have the most. He did serve 2 terms, though, so you got to keep that in mind. But he also had the most pocket vetoes as well. But if you want a little bit closer look at this, just look in your book. It's in there. The president is also the leader of the party. And in his situation, you're going to see that that's going to help and hurt his party. For instance, there's a psychological bond between congressional leaders and the president who are from the same party. So they all automatically, even if they don't really know each other, have that bond and are able to use it to help one another. But it doesn't matter if you are part of a party or not. If you do not, if you do something very controversial, do something very wrong, you're probably going to lose your party support. But they are the leaders of the party, and they use this in several different ways. They can offer candidates help who need it, or withhold favors from candidates if they're not doing well or not agreeing with the president. In addition, the presidential coattails we see here are basically when voters cast their ballots for congressional candidates because they are from the president's party. It doesn't always work that way, but it does work sometimes. Public support is the key to a president's tenure in office, because the public support is what helps him get things passed in Congress and get his policies put into place. If he has strong public approval, he generally can use it as leverage in Congress. It doesn't always work, but typically if he has public approval, Congress is going to do what he wants, because those people vote for congressional members as well. When it comes to mandates, in this case, a presidential mandate is just basically the belief that voters strongly support the president's character and his policies. And mandates don't really happen that often, but presidents try to claim that they do all the time. In order for the president to get things passed, he also needs to have legislative skills. He needs to know how to work Congress. And he does that in several different ways. And one of the best examples I can give you would be LBJ when he was the president of the United States. He knew the ins and outs of Congress, so he knew how to work them. They do bargaining. I'll give you this if you give me that. It's pretty infrequent. It does happen, but it's not terribly common. Also, they are very strategic. They know that they are in the honeymoon phase right at the beginning. That's when they are the most popular, is at the beginning of their presidency. So that's when they try to push as many things as they can possibly right at the beginning, when they know that they'll have the support of Congress. They do set the agenda, and they set the key agenda for the nation. So Congress does kind of have to look at what they want. But they got to really use their skills, and they have to compete with other factors in Congress, because Congress doesn't revolve around the president. They have other things that they need to do. So he needs to figure out skills other than what he already has just to make sure to get in there. The president is also the chief diplomat, meaning the chief leader on foreign relations. Some things that he does is that he does negotiate treaties with other countries, but to be formally approved, they need to be ratified by a 2/3 vote in the Senate, an example of Madisonian models, checks and balances. He also can use executive agreements to take care of routine matters with other countries, similar to that of a treaty, but a little bit different. It's not as formal. Also, he may negotiate peace between other nations, like we saw with Jimmy Carter in the Camp David Accords. He helped make a formal peace treaty between Egypt and Israel. And they lead the U.S. in defense and economic issues all across the world as well. To my left right here, you will see an example of a successful treaty maker. This is Woodrow Wilson, and he successfully negotiated the Treaty of Versailles after World War I, and Senate approved. Oh, right. This is really awkward. He was really bad at that. The president is also the commander-in-chief. That's probably the most common title that you've heard the president be called, if you have heard one before this. Why did they do this? Why did the founding fathers make him the commander-in-chief? Because they wanted a civilian to be in charge of the military, not an actual general or admiral of the military. The president often has to make many military decisions, very important ones, so he does ask the help of those people who are actually in the military, but he does have the final say. And when the founding fathers made this, they did not realize that the absolute power and control that the president would have over the armed forces, it was completely unthinkable over 200 years ago, for instance, like the nuclear arsenal that we have today. That was something absolutely unthinkable by the founding fathers, but still, it still goes in line with the idea that they have a civilian running the military. When it comes to the Constitution, in it says that the Congress and the president do share war powers. Congress has the right to declare war, but once they do, the president is the commander-in-chief and gets to decide on the troops and equipment that gets sent over in conflicts. But we were starting to see many undeclared wars popping up in the 20th century, and the one that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back was Vietnam, where people were upset that the president was wielding too much power when it came to war and not checking in with Congress, and that just was upsetting many people. So Congress made the War Powers Resolution in 1973 that basically limited the powers presidents of their use of the military, that said that the president must warn the Congress 48 hours in advance that they are going to have an invasion, and if after this invasion, after 60 days, they do not like what's being done, Congress has the right to either stop the invasion immediately or they can actually grant an extension. Some people feel that this is unconstitutional because it violates the separation of powers, because in no way in the Constitution does it ever say that Congress has the right to check the president like this. But presidents continue to test this. They really have never had a problem with sending troops over and having Congress stop them since they made this in 1973. When it comes to the president as a crisis manager, it can either help or hurt his image. With current technology, they can handle crises much quicker, but I'll just give you an example of one that whose image got hurt. Basically, in the 1970s, Nixon, Ford, and Carter all had their images hurt when they couldn't handle the oil crisis of the oil embargo, so that hurt them. But then we see President Bush in 2001, whose image got he was considered the most popular president of all time after the 9/11 attacks because of how he handled the crisis. When it comes to working with Congress, yes, the president is the chief of diplomacy. He is the one that is the leader in foreign affairs, but he does need to ask Congress for help when it comes to not only support but for funding as well. Going public is probably the president's greatest source of influence that he has, because this is where he can gain public support, and this is his role of being called head of state, where he basically is our ceremonial figure, and he basically does things in certain functions or cuts ribbons or things like that. But it's really important because it helps the press see him favorably, and then by using that linkage institution of the press, he is able to portray to us, the people, the citizens, that he is a good guy and that usually will support him more for it. When it comes to presidential approval, the White House staff, that's the number one goal, is to make sure that the president has high approval ratings, because the higher the approval rating, the more they're likely to get done. But if you look at this chart below, as you can see that there's many presidents on here, and most of the time you're going to see this too, where their approval rating is highest at the beginning of their presidency. This is known as the honeymoon period, which is, like I said before, the period where they try to get as much of their policy pushed into play as possible, because they know, they've seen history, and they realize that some of these times and other presidents, that they usually, typically, have the highest approval rating right at the beginning, or typically at the end of a crisis. You can see there's a little bit of an increase in certain presidency, like Nixon's. We see that happen a little bit between 71 and 73 when he was up for re-election. He did that whole trip to China. You can see the improvement in George H.W. Bush when he won the Gulf War, and you could see the little amount of improvement in George W. Walker Bush when he was president during 9/11. This graph above that we're looking at is showing the overall approval rating of presidents during this time period. And you can see that some of them had pretty good approval rating. Kennedy did for a while, but that's also because Kennedy wasn't president for very long. But he did have the highest, and that helped make him considered one of the greatest presidents we've ever had. If you look at the age of limits, that would be the 1970s. You can see that that's some of the lowest approval ratings, and that would be presidents Nixon, Ford, and Carter. They had some pretty low approval ratings when it came to their average. Not too high above them would be President Bush, George W. Bush, the son of George H.W. Bush. He probably would have had a lower approval rating if it wasn't for 9/11 and for the beginning of the Iraq War, because ironically enough, George W. Bush had both the highest and the lowest presidential approval ratings in American history. The president tries in many different ways to get people to support his policy, and in one way he tries to get policy support is making a speech or a televised message to the public, but usually it's with very little success because they're not really receptive of the president's message, or they might misperceive what the president is trying to say to them. Probably the most famous example of this is Jimmy Carter's Malaise speech, or the Crisis of Confidence speech, where when he was talking to the people, he was basically trying to get them all pumped up and riled up to work hard for their country. But in reality, when he was speaking to them, he was really saying, and what the people perceived him as saying, was that they weren't doing their job, and it was their fault that they weren't confident enough in their government, and they needed to be the one making the changes, and needed to be the one that were being confident in their government and trusting them again. But other ways that the president has tried to get people to support him is to mobilize the public, to get the people to talk to their congressmen and say, hey, if you want something done, talk to Congress. They're the ones that need to get done, kind of pointing the finger at them. But this really can backfire in one of two ways. First of all, we don't care. The public in general is very apathetic and just inattentive. They really don't care about policy unless it's something very near and dear to their heart, but overall they don't care. And also, if they don't say anything, that speaks as loudly as if they actually did say something. What is the president's relationship like with the media? Well, they kind of are adversaries, or more like you could think of them as frenemies. They work together, but a lot of times they really don't get along because the press needs a story, and the president just wants to get his agenda across, and that's not necessarily what the press always wants to hear. Now, the president isn't usually the one directly dealing with the press. It's usually the press secretary, who is a worker in the West Wing or the White House staff for the president, who directly interacts with the press about the president's policies. Now, the media isn't really focusing on policies. They want to know the body watch. They want something entertaining, like when you've seen the president playing basketball, or the President Obama playing golf, or when you saw President H.W. Bush puke all over the Japanese emperor, or when you saw President George W. Bush choke on some popcorn. It's like that's what they care about. They'd rather entertain, not actually give people policy, which is another reason why people don't care about policy, because they don't really hear about it. The president's coverage, the press's coverage of the president, really has tended to become more and more negative, and that happened ever since the whole Vietnam and Watergate scandals in the 60s and 70s. When it comes to the presidency and democracy and the scope of government, there are two different ideas. Some people believe when it comes to democracy that the president has tied to too many policies, too many policy concerns, and that they are doing too much. They have too much power. While others believe that checks and balances are limiting them too much for having power. When it comes to the scope of government and presidency, meaning how much bigger or smaller the president has made the office of the presidency, the amount of scope they have over the government, what they get to cover over the government in the United States. It depends on the president. Some presidents, typically in the 20th century, has made the positions much, much bigger. It really started with TR, and then it really, really expanded under FDR. That was where we saw a big expansion of the scope of government. We've seen some of them limited a little bit, but most of all, ever since the 20th century, when we saw TR with the bully pulpit, he created the modern presidency. He expanded the scope of government for the presidency. So what's the moral of the story here when it comes to Chapter 13 in the presidency? Number one, Americans expect a lot out of their presidents because they're the figure that they see, but they're really not going to get a lot because there's so many people that they have to deal with that have their own agendas and their own little spheres of power. Number two, presidents work as part of that big organization. It's just not them deciding everything. They have to work part of not only the government in general, but specifically their relationship with Congress and their bureaucracy. The president's leadership in Congress is central, but it's extremely difficult to get things passed, especially in a time like right now when there's a divided government and the House is controlled by the Republicans while the Democrats control the Senate and the presidency. The president's roles and responsibilities really are in check by different branches of government, and that goes along with the Madisonian model. So I'm Mrs. Thorson. Have a good night.